From the nation's capital, the American Enterprise Institute for Public Policy Research presents Public Policy Forums, a series of programs featuring the nation's top authorities presenting their differing views on the vital issues which confront us. Today's topic: how much defense spending is enough?
Defense spending, like taxes, appears to be something that we Americans will just have to live with forever. But how much defense spending is enough? Why does the defense budget seemingly have to increase each year, despite the fact we are no longer fighting a war? Taxpayers, as well as members of the House and Senate, are asking questions. What should be the balance, for example, between military spending and domestic spending? Does the defense budget provide too much or too little for the sophisticated weapons of the future? And this question: has excessive defense spending been caused by pressure from military contractors and by the creation of new jobs? Welcome to another rational debate, part of the Public Policy Forum series presented by AEI, the American Enterprise Institute, a nonpartisan, nonprofit research and education organization. Our topic today is: how much defense spending is enough? Our two debaters are experts in the defense field. Les Aspin, Democratic representative from Wisconsin. Mr. Aspin is a member of the House Armed Services Committee. He's a graduate of Yale University, holds a master's degree from Oxford University, and a PhD in economics from MIT. Congressman Aspin served as economic advisor to former Defense Secretary Robert McNamara. He is serving in his third term in Congress. Jack Kemp, Republican representative from New York State. Mr. Kemp, a graduate of Occidental College, is a member of the House Appropriations Subcommittee on Defense. He spent 4 years as a member of the House Education and Labor Committee. Congressman Kemp is also serving his third term on Capitol Hill. John Charles Daly will moderate the debate. Mr. Daly formerly served as director of the Voice of America. He spent many years with CBS and ABC as a news correspondent, analyst, and news executive. Now, Mr. Daly.
Time is the great leveler, and for the past 30 years, more than 30 years, from the birth of the nuclear age, it has been as inevitable as the rising sun that the military scales between the United States and the Soviet Union would come into some degree of balance. In the mid-70s, at the very least, it is clear that the balance of military capability is so finely drawn that no issue burdens the consciousness of America more than the adequacy of her defenses. It is a critical subject for a rational debate. Our subject, then: how much defense spending is enough? To open debate, Representative Jack Kemp of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Daly. Since World War II, too many Americans have taken our national security for granted. It has been viewed as almost a matter of inalienable right, rather than one to be earned and preserved through effort. The facts, I believe, now show that we in America can no longer take our security for granted. It is increasingly jeopardized, and this jeopardy stems primarily from two basic factors. One factor is the Soviet Union's relentless drive to achieve military superiority, both in conventional forces as well as strategic nuclear weapons. Accompanying this drive is the development of a civil defense program, or more accurately, a war survival program, which is also undermining our deterrent strength by making the Soviet Union less vulnerable to U.S. retaliation, upon which the credibility of our deterrent is predicated. The other factor is the belief by too many Americans that since both sides have the ability to, quote, destroy each other many times over, and that as a consequence, nuclear war would be so devastating that it is totally unthinkable to the Soviet Union as well as to ourselves. This unilateral American belief in overkill draws comfort from the, quote, balance of terror and makes many Americans question our defense expenditures. I want to speak today to these two factors. Too many people are unwilling to look at facts, and every credible source, it seems to me, both military and civilian, provides evidence of an unprecedented Soviet buildup in strategic and conventional weapons. But of course, there are always those eager to tell us that it's all a hoax, all designed just to con the Congress into increasing defense expenditures to benefit a defense lobby. The will to disbelieve the obvious is based partly on the inability of humane Americans to come to grips with Soviet tactics and objectives, and it is strengthened, I believe, by the unwillingness of political leaders to admit that the United States is yielding military superiority to the Soviet Union, both strategically and in conventional terms. How much is enough depends upon the perception of the threat. The danger of the overkill argument is that it blunts the perception of that threat. Americans are taking refuge behind overkill, in my belief, the same way the French took refuge behind the Maginot Line. But the overkill argument misses the following point. It deals with weapons and inventory, not with alert, reliable, survivable, penetrating weapons, subject to proper command and control. It deals with today's situation rather than that of the critical period, 5, 10, or 15 years from now. Soviet military doctrine and military writings have never accepted the concept of overkill or the concept of mutual assured destruction. These concepts, and the latter is the basis of our defense posture, are rejected today by the Soviet Union. There, one does not find the doctrine that once a certain nuclear force level exists, one has nuclear sufficiency to deter an aggressor regardless of his force level. Instead, there is increasing emphasis in the Soviet Union on the survivability, and they are even talking about victory in hypothetical nuclear wars. They stress that adequate measures can greatly reduce the destructive potential of nuclear weapons and that war remains in the nuclear age still a permissible and valid instrument of policy. Perhaps nothing contrasts more starkly with our interpretation of overkill than is the fact that the Soviets have developed a cold launch technique for intercontinental ballistic missiles that allow their missile silos to be very quickly reloaded. This difference in attitude means many things which are important indeed and are crucial to our defense posture in this last third of the 20th century. It means, for example, that we may have more confidence in our deterrent than the Soviets have respect for it. The French indeed had great faith in the Maginot Line, more so than the Germans. And this differing assessment, this differing perception, led not only to war, but to the defeat of France. It also means that the Soviets may be up to perhaps different things than we are. Whereas we are busy deterring, the Soviets may be busy preparing for international aggression or at least intimidation in diplomatic relations. That is one possible reading not only of this massive Soviet military buildup and deployment throughout the world, but of the comprehensive Soviet program in which population survival measures are combined with the dispersal of key industries, underground and hardened industrial sites, hardened facilities for protecting the political leadership, and their nationwide command and control structure. If we add to this their massive air defense system and their strategic doctrine statements, which talk in terms of blunting their enemy's nuclear capability by means of preemptive first strikes, we have indications that they do not share our commitment to defensive postures. In the case of the Soviet Union, with its enormous military expansion, its hardened missile silos, its extensive civil defense program, and their dispersal and hardening of its industry, we just do not have overkill. Even less do we have it if we take into account that we do not have a first strike doctrine or capability, and that our defense depends upon the number of our nuclear weapons which could survive a Soviet attack and be delivered on target. The belief in overkill, combined with our current advantage in nuclear warheads, have led us and are leading us to increasingly base our security in international affairs on SALT negotiations. In fact, popular wisdom is that SALT is becoming the fourth leg of our defense posture, and perhaps even a substitute for essential defense capabilities. The Secretary of Defense, the Joint Chiefs of Staff have all testified before our Defense Appropriations Subcommittee that the fiscal year 1977 defense budget was predicated in large part upon the assumption that the current strategic arms limitations talks would be successful. Yet it is SALT itself that has legitimized the Soviet missile throw weight advantage, which will permit the Soviets to rapidly, at some point, if current trends continue, eliminate our warhead advantage. Critics of the U.S. defense spending have emphasized the security provided by our current lead in number of warheads, but I think fail to point out offsetting Soviet advantages and these trends, ominous trends, in the words of our last three Secretaries of Defense, Mr. Laird, Schlesinger, and Rumsfeld. Those who emphasize our lead today are neglecting the trends which are producing perhaps a Soviet lead tomorrow. Now, there are people who say, why worry about the Soviets having nuclear superiority when superiority is not usable anyway? I don't want to play the role of an alarmist, but there are many facts which need to be brought to the attention of the American people. And these facts and figures demonstrate the challenge that the tremendous Soviet weapon capability presents to our ability to maintain a high-quality deterrent in the interests of peace and freedom of the United States and our allies around the world. A while back, Secretary of State Kissinger raised the rhetorical question, what in the name of God is superiority? What could the Soviet Union do about it, or do with it? The Secretary went on to say that nuclear superiority is devoid of any operational meaning. If he is right, the trends that I discussed are meaningless, for assured destruction has rendered superiority useless. But if this is so, why then is the Soviets investing so heavily, not only in achieving nuclear superiority, but in attempting to increase it? In early 1945, when our GIs were pushing towards Germany, it surely must have been unthinkable to us that anyone would send millions of men, women, and children into gas chambers. But as it turned out, it wasn't unthinkable to Adolf Hitler. Now, surely I believe that the Soviet leaders are a lot more rational than Adolf Hitler. Still, when we consider the prospects of nuclear war, I think we need to ask ourselves, how does it look when viewed through our adversaries' eyes, when contemplated in terms of their philosophy and their definitions of morality? If the Soviets believed that nuclear superiority was not usable, they would not be doubling throw weight, as well as increasing the accuracy of their nuclear delivery systems. With the deployment of 4 new ICBMs, they can quadruple the advantage over the United States. Even less would they have under development, still more new ICBMs, even before they complete the deployment of their new missiles in current production. Secretary Rumsfeld testified before the Appropriations Committee, of which I'm a member, excuse me, that the trends of the past 10 years are adverse with respect to the military balance. Now, some members of Congress very honestly and sincerely disagree, but more importantly, Andrei Gromyko, the foreign minister of the Soviet Union, seems to agree with Secretary Rumsfeld's assessment. Interpreting the trends, Mr. Gromyko stated last September that the forces of international communism now have a visibly increased preponderance and may now be in a position to lay down the direction of international politics. Whether they are or are not in that position at this time, there is every indication that they intend to be in that position very soon. It is certainly in the interests of the American people and in the interests of peace and freedom in the world for us in the Congress to do our part to help prevent the Soviets from achieving the position towards which they are driving and to make it useless for them to try. Not since the war preparations of Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler in the 1930s has a major nation at peace devoted such a high percentage of its resources to the production of weapons and to the buildup of related scientific, technical, and industrial base for military production. In the Soviet Union, the support for détente has thus far brought only rhetoric, virtually with no results to the United States. In the give and take of international détente, the United States has been giving while the Soviets have been taking. Soviet leaders and official propagandists have consistently made it clear that détente and coexistence require an intensification of the ideological struggle, which is to them a euphemism for the export and support for wars of national liberation. In Leonid Brezhnev's words, peaceful coexistence rests on a system of principles that make it possible to avoid a major international conflict in the course of development of revolutionary processes within individual countries. Ideological struggle, he says, and Cold War are totally different concepts. The struggle for national liberation, which the Soviet policy actively discourages and in fact at Helsinki codified, in Eastern Europe is actively promoted in other areas of the world. Indeed, the Soviet Union described the Arab attack on Israel as a war of national liberation, and as was their use of surrogate Cuban troops in Angola. Any relaxation of ideological tension has been explicitly rejected by the Soviets. In both the Soviet Union as most of its Eastern European allied countries, the official policy of normalizing relations with the United States has been the occasion for intensified political repression and for campaigns stressing the importance of the struggle against so-called reactionary forces and for the victory of socialism in the world arena. The level of our defense spending should not be dictated on dollar comparisons, nor should it be decided by the desire to create jobs, nor should it be decided by a comparison with the level of spending on domestic programs, nor should it be decided by what we think it would be nice to have. It must totally be decided by the actual military capability of the Soviet Union, regardless of how much it costs them. It is dictated by the size and kind of force that we might have to defend against in a crisis. It is dictated by conditions in the world over which we do not often have control. But in the highly regarded report of the Library of Congress on the United States-Soviet military balance, and I quote, "As it now stands," in their wrap-up of that report, they said, "the quantitative balance continues to shift towards the Soviet Union, and the U.S. qualitative superiority, which never compensated completely and in certain respects is slowly slipping away." In historical perspective, there is only one thing worse than an arms race, and that is arms inferiority. For as John F. Kennedy said not too many years ago, there is no first or second in that race. There is only first and last. Thank you, Mr. Daley.
The opposing view, Representative Les Aspin of Wisconsin.
Thank you, Mr. Daley. I think the question, how much defense spending is enough, is an answerable question. Let me talk a little bit about it from the standpoint of conventional forces, just open the debate further because Congressman Kemp talked about a lot from the strategic forces. The conventional forces, the general purpose forces, are of course where the most amount of the money for the budget is. About 80% of the budget goes for conventional forces. How do you decide how much is enough in conventional forces? When Secretary McNamara first came to the Pentagon, what he did was he ordered a study. And he said, all right, suppose we were to go into a situation where every one of the trouble spots in the world that the United States faces, suppose all of them erupted at once, how many forces would the United States need to take care of that kind of situation? Well, the answer came back, of course, a staggering amount of forces, 50 divisions, I don't know, large numbers of equipment. So then he said, well, we can't assume that they're all going to happen at once. What happens if we assume that they don't all happen at once? And eventually we evolved into what became the 2.5 war strategy. We assumed that 2 of these major contingencies would happen at once, along with, at the same time, one of the minor contingencies. We had a 2.5 war strategy. Later, that was revised under Secretary Laird to a 1.5 war strategy. But the military has never been happy with that situation because they thought we never really had the forces to fight 2.5 wars or to fight 1.5 wars. But anyway, the theory of how to go about it is, I think, still applicable. If we were to ask ourselves, how much defense spending is enough today? I think the way you would do it would be to go to the world posture of the United States, our foreign policy, and say, all right, what are the vital foreign interests that the United States has that we want to defend? Our vital national security interests. And from that, derive the forces necessary to defend those areas. Now, I personally would say, besides the North American continent, that the vital interests of the United States are Europe, they are Japan, they are the Middle East, and I don't know much beyond that. But I think that you could get a large degree of agreement in Congress that those are the major areas of the United States' interest. And beyond that, the agreement would break down. But now, if we approached our defense spending questions in that way, I think we would come up with an answer. It wouldn't give us a single determination. Obviously, there would still be disagreement. There would be disagreement between Jack Kemp and myself as to what were our vital interests. There would be disagreement between us as to what forces were necessary to defend the vital interests once we had agreed on the vital interests. But at least the debate would be rational. At least there would be some direction to the whole thing. And after that, we could then proceed to think about, is there any ways that we could improve the efficiency of this Defense Department that we've got? Once we've decided on the general force levels that we needed, we would ask the question about efficiencies. And are we really spending, is really all that money that we're spending on personnel a good idea? And look at what's happening to pensions, and look at all these pay and allowances, and look at the ways that we can save money, and start looking for efficiencies in that way. Now that, I think, is a rational way to go about ending up with a defense budget. And I think if we did that, we would end up with a defense budget which is less than the amount of the defense budget that we have now. But we don't do that. Now, why don't we do that? Well, obviously, there's some institutional factors that prevent us from doing that. But there are two other factors which are preventing us from doing that today, and which I think are particularly pertinent. One of those is this crazy overreaction that we have to what the Soviets are doing with their Defense Department budget. That, I think, needs to be put into perspective. The debate seems to revolve around such questions about who is spending more, who has more equipment of tanks and planes, etc., what are the defense spending trends in the two countries, and then sometimes it jumps back and forth and interrelates one to another. If you do the calculations in dollars, it turns out that the Soviets are spending more. If you do the calculation in rubles, it turns out that we're spending more. Second, the debate on who has more equipment is also, I think, not really very fruitful. Clearly, the Soviets have a lot more equipment than we do in certain kinds of circumstances. But there are certain rather special conditions that the Soviets face. The Soviets have an enemy on their border of China. There's the quality factor. Our equipment is less, but it is of greater quality. The Soviets have inventory factors. For some reason, they never throw anything away. The Soviets just keep piling stuff up in the inventory. The Soviets are absolutely buggy about the kind of equipment that they have. I mean, they just pile up sheer numbers. The Soviets, for example, and this piece of information plus 15 cents will get you a cup of coffee, but the Soviet Union at the beginning of World War II had more tanks than all the other countries in the world put together. Now, they didn't know how to use them. The tanks weren't very good. The Germans knew how to use them, but they had a lot of equipment. The Soviets have always had a lot of equipment. Third factor is the question about the trends. And here I think there's something to be said. And this, I think, is true about what's going on in the Soviet-US debate. And I think it is true to say that the Soviet defense budget has been increasing steadily but not very quickly over the last 10 years. And the United States defense budget has been declining. I mean, it's gone up for Vietnam up to 68 and then down. But over the last 10 years, say from 1964, the overall result, eliminating the bulge for Vietnam, has been a gradual 1% decline, 1% per year decline over 10 years. Soviets, on the other hand, is an increase, 2.5%, 3% per year increase. And that, I think, is true. And I think that what you say is that cannot be ignored. That is a factor for concern, and it raises a lot of very interesting questions about what the Soviets are doing. But we should not be deterred from a rational buying for what we need, and especially we should not be panicked into increasing our defense budget astronomically. Okay, the second thing is the credibility complex. It is an outgrowth of Vietnam and Watergate. It arises because a rather large number of people abroad, as well as here in this country, think that thanks to Vietnam and Watergate, the United States, its government and its people, no longer have the will, the determination, the unity of purpose to pursue its own self-interest in the interest of the peace. Now, international credibility is a pretty elusive thing. It was in pursuit of international credibility that we stayed in the war in Vietnam a lot longer than we should have, a lot beyond all other rational reasons for staying in the war in Vietnam. We stayed because of this credibility problem. We were originally there to fight for freedom. We were there to prevent aggression. We were there because of the domino theory. We were here because of another Munich. All of those reasons fell aside. The reason we stayed ultimately was because if we left and abandoned that ally, other allies around the world would think we would abandon them too. And other adversaries would realize that we abandoned allies when the going got tough. Ultimately, that is really why we stayed in that war for as long as we did. And of course, we eventually left, and we eventually, of course, lost a lot of credibility. And it is this concern over credibility which really prevents us from helping us to determine our vital interests. We can say rationally that we ought to go back and determine our defense posture on a defense of Japan, of Western Europe, of the Middle East, our vital interests. But the fact is we're committed to a lot of other countries around the world, 44 countries, informal agreements, as Kissinger said, with dozens more. We've got commitments to 2/3 of the countries of the world. Now, why don't we say, all right, let's rearrange that? Because of this credibility. After Watergate, after Vietnam, we can't rearrange that without losing more credibility. In fact, it's this kind of fear of losing further credibility which propels us into getting involved into places where we don't have any commitments, like Angola. Well, now again, like in the debate over how much as the Soviets are doing, I think credibility is not a totally nonsense point. It is real. That credibility point is real. Actually, what it all comes down to, of course, ultimately is the nuclear deterrent. That nuclear deterrent rests on the credibility. The only way that we will be sure that we will never be faced with having to use the nuclear deterrent is if our adversaries believe that it is credible that we will not use it, that we will use it. So that credibility is in fact very real indeed. And it spills over into arguments for greater defense budgets. I think that there's a lot of people who think just for credibility's sake we ought to have a bigger defense budget. And I think that's wrong. I don't think you can buy credibility with greater defense. I think if you doubled the defense budget, you would not restore the United States' credibility to the late 50s, early 60s. We're not going to restore the status quo anti-Vietnam by doubling the defense budget. On the other hand, it's possible that you can't cut the defense budget very much either. A very large cut in the defense budget, on the other hand, might mean that we do damage credibility. I think there's maybe a little bit of a symmetry there. But these two factors, the concern over what the Russians are doing and this credibility concern are really what are preventing us from having a really good rational defense budget today, which is lower than which I think would be a lot lower than the one we have. So what do we do? What's my recommendation for how much is enough? Let me suggest doing two things. First, what do we do with this year's defense budget, and what do we do in the long run? With this year's defense budget, the current defense budget, I think we ought to cut it, the president's request, 5%. I think that given what the Russians are doing, there is some argument for a real increase in the defense budget. The president's proposal is for a 7% real increase in defense spending. I think let's give it a 2% real increase. Let's match the Soviets' increase and while we figure out what to do. I think it's important for another reason. I think that there's too much in that budget which is not there really. The Pentagon sends over its budget. When they made up this budget, they had no idea the mood in Congress would be to pass everything they sent over this year. So they made up their usual budget with a lot of cut insurance and a lot of blubber in there that they knew Congress would cut out so they'd have what they really had. If they were making up that budget today, they would make it up a lot differently than they would than the budget that we're looking at. So I think we can cut it. If we don't cut it, we're going to have a record number of reprogramming decisions coming up to Congress. But let's cut it. In the long run, what do we do after that? I think in the long run, we really have to think through this question. Think through this question about what the Russians are up to and what our response ought to be. Think through this question about this credibility and how important is credibility and what does credibility, and is credibility really indivisible? If we lose credibility in Angola, does that reflect on the credibility of our nuclear deterrent? I think we've got to ask those kind of questions and think those kinds of things through. You see, I think ultimately what we're getting down to a problem. And the problem is that the kind of forces that we buy for perceptions are not the kind of forces that we might buy for warfighting. For perceptions against the Russians and for perceptions of credibility, we would be buying certain kinds of forces, large numbers of equipment. We wouldn't be buying much readiness. We wouldn't be buying maybe many precision-guided munitions. We wouldn't be buying captor mines. When the U.S. News and World Report comes out with their chart of how much we have versus how much the Soviets have, mines aren't in there. Laser-guided artillery shells aren't in there. Smart bombs aren't in there. It's tanks, armored personnel carriers, other kinds of equipment. The debate, I think, is pushing us. This concern about credibility, just higher defense budgets for higher defense budgets' sake, the concern about what the Russians are doing, more numbers for more numbers' sake, are pushing and warping our defense structure. And right now, the concern about credibility and the concern over what the Russians are doing are bedeviling the budget cutters in Congress. But I think ultimately, those two concerns will start to bedevil those people who are really concerned about a strong and adequate United States defense. Thank you very much.
Our topic is how much defense spending is enough, and now to rebuttal, Representative Kemp.
Well, thank you, Mr. Daley. I very strongly would agree with my friend and colleague Les Aspin that the healthy debate process could bring about the type of pairing, bringing about efficiency, bringing about reductions in unneeded manpower costs. In fact, he and I cooperated in attempting to remove, in fact, we did remove the 1% kicker from the cost of living increase, or above and beyond the cost of living increase, which would save, what, $3.5 billion over the next 3 to 4 years. So the healthy debate in this country has begun. I think it is going on right now. I think that the trends that my friend from Wisconsin alluded to in his opening remarks are much more ominous than he would give respect to. There is, we must remember, no such healthy debate going on in the Soviet Union, at least in public. It isn't a question of dollars versus dollars, rubles versus dollars, or numbers of equipment. It is a question of perceptions. It is a question, indeed, of credibility, and it is a question, if we ever come to that brink again, as we were in 1962 over the Cuban Missile Crisis, which side would blink? Mr. Russ, the former Secretary of State, said it was the Soviets in 1962 that blinked, primarily because of the credibility of our deterrence, primarily because of the credibility of our strategic superiority at that time. The question is today, even more so the question will be in 1980, 1981, 1982, if again we came to that brink, which side would blink? And I think there's going to be some question as to which side will blink by that time if steps are not taken to reverse and arrest those trends. The purpose of spending more money, a modest amount, 7% more real growth in the defense budget after a number of years of cuts in the last few years, is primarily to upgrade the deterrent of this country, to primarily upgrade our triad deterrent, our land-based and sea-based intercontinental ballistic missiles, as well as our bomber force. And I think that is primarily what is involved in the increase in the real growth of the United States. And I think that is a strong diplomatic signal to the Soviets that we want to reduce the arms race. We want a cap on strategic nuclear weapons, that we are willing to negotiate, but the negotiations ought to be mutual, reciprocal, on a quid pro quo basis. And in lieu of that, in lieu of any attempt by them to honestly negotiate or in good faith negotiate those differences, that we indeed will take the steps to upgrade our deterrent capability. I would agree with my friend that it is only the vital national security interests of this country for which we should spend money. I'm not interested in, as anyone else is, in being a policeman for the world. But we must remind ourselves that the Soviets are certainly not a policeman, and in a world as dangerous as this world is today, it is certainly more dangerous than it was for the past few years. It seems to me that looking at these trends militarily, looking at spending, looking at some of the buildup, looking at what has happened in Angola, Angola in and of itself is not what is at stake. The answer to Angola was not in Luanda. The answer was, it seems to me, in Moscow. and for the United States to send a signal to Moscow that we were willing to negotiate SALT II, to send our Secretary of State to Moscow at a time when the Soviets were exporting and supporting Cuban revolutionary forces in Angola, seemed to me to be the wrong kind of a signal to send. And all I'm saying is, at this point, given the current conditions in the world, it seems to me that this nation should take strong steps to upgrade its strategic and conventional military capability in lieu of a SALT II agreement.
Your rebuttal, Representative Aspin.
Thank you. Let me allude to something that, not so much that Congressman Kemp said as so much that he alluded to, but I've heard others say it, and particularly in the Pentagon has said it, and particularly in the Air Force. The Secretary of the Air Force, the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, saying that the buildup in the Soviet Union is, we haven't seen anything like it since the buildup of Hitler in World War II. I mean, that is just absolutely crazy. I mean, it's just absolutely nuts. The implication of that is that the Soviet Union is building up a massive force in order to catch us off guard and to annihilate the United States. If it is, that's of course possible what they're doing, that they're doing it by incremental steps, but they're not doing it very seriously if they're doing it. A 2.7% increase per year, to say that that's the biggest increase is absurd. When you look at over the last 10 years, the Chinese defense budget has increased by 8% per year. The Japanese defense budget, Japan hasn't got much defense, but has increased by 9% per year. The Israeli defense budget has increased by over 20% per year. It is not the most important increase in defense expenditures since Hitler's in World War II. What are the Soviets up to? Are they really out to do us in? Maybe, maybe not. My guess is probably not. That what's going on in the Soviet Union has a lot more to do with the fact that they're Russians than the fact that they're communists. That the Russians are committed to a certain kind of philosophy, which leads to certain kinds of things. There is a paranoia in the Soviet Union about defense. They always think that they're under attack. They have a certain ideology that tells them that history is with them and that they must take advantage of every opportunity. I think that some of what they do perhaps is for internal reasons, but they move in increments. It started way back in the 1930s. They have not the really sophisticated view, as Congressman Kemp is saying, that we have of how much is enough. They probably figure in general that a little bit more is better than a little bit less, and they're taking advantage of things that come along. And I don't think there's any question they're going to take advantage of Angolas that come along. I don't think there's any question if they see a target of opportunity, they're going to take advantage of it. But that doesn't mean that they're building up a defense establishment that's getting ready, preparing secretly and quietly for another war. I think the Soviets realized the dangers of nuclear war. I think that they realize more than most countries what nuclear war really means, or what warfare really means. I think it's obviously something we have to be careful about. So what do we do about it? What do we do? I think that the question comes down to several options. Clearly, we don't want the Soviets to increase their defense spending and our defense spending to go down. We have a couple of options, and I'm really not sure what the best thing to do is. We could match them. If they're increasing their defense budget by X percent, we could increase ours by X percent to match them. Secondly, we could perhaps open negotiations with them on the totality of the defense budget. Or third, we could let it be known to them through diplomatic channels as well as through open public channels that we know their defense budget is increasing and we're very unhappy with that. In fact, we've already done the third, and it's already been noted as various people who have watched Soviet press have noted that occurring. And I think it's a very interesting and important thing right now that we should decide what it is our response ought to be. But I think there's a very great danger that our response could be an over-response and something. Our whole history of dealing with the Soviet Union seems to oscillate up and down. There are big friends in World War II. There are big friends after SALT. There are big enemies after World War II. There are big enemies now. Let's not have these oscillations. Let's have a more rational and a more consistent view of what the Soviet Union is up to. Namely, that they can't be trusted. You've got to keep your eyes on, but they're not out for suicide either.
All right, this concludes the first segment of our rational debate on how much defense spending is enough.
As our debaters have shown, the question, how much defense spending is enough, is not easy to answer. Largely, they say, it could depend on how successful détente becomes between the United States and Russia. There are two other basic questions, it would seem. Just exactly what do we define as the vital interests of the United States? And how much of an increased threat is the Russian military machine? Another question that could bear on the future of defense spending involves the possibility, at least, that U.S. armed forces may one day become unionized. Let's go now to our experts in the audience who will question our debaters.
All right, may we have the first question, please? You, sir?
Rob Oates, Congressman Steve Sims' office. For Congressman Aspin, the Soviet leadership continually re-emphasizes their long-term goal of world domination. And recent examples have been their influence in the Middle East and Angola. In view of their past actions, how can you justify ignoring their often stated goal of world domination?
I don't ignore it. My only response is that they can't do it. And we must make sure that they can't do it. I mean, there's all kinds of ideologies in the history of the world that had in mind world domination. And I believe that the Soviets are not going to change their ideology. I don't believe for a minute they're going to give up their rhetoric. We have an awful lot of rhetoric that's associated with our country and with our ways of doing things. But reality forces us to do things other than what we would like in a lot of cases. And reality has forced the Soviet Union into doing things other than which you would like, and I think reality will continue to.
Do you want to address this?
Yes, I would like to. It isn't enough to ask the rhetorical question, what are the Soviets up to? It isn't enough to perhaps predict on the basis of past actions. It seems to me that we ought to look at the real world. We ought to look at events in Southeast Asia, where the Soviets at Paris were the co-guarantors of the Paris Peace Accords. Look in the Middle East. Look in Africa, the attempts to imperialize, the attempts to establish bases in Somalia, Angola, perhaps Mozambique. It seems to me that predicated upon those real-world examples that the United States ought to take very seriously its role of upgrading both parts of its military capability. The question is, A, what will happen by the early 1980s if we did not upgrade our triad? And B, of course the Soviets are rational, as was Hitler when he denied help to Mussolini in 1936 when fascist Italy moved down into Abyssinia in northern Africa, and no one moved. Adolf Hitler wouldn't even move because of his concern that if he did, the Western Allies would rise up, close the Suez Canal, and start to rearm. He didn't want to send a signal. No one moved. His next step was to rearm himself. The next step was the Rhineland, Austria, Sudetenland, Czechoslovakia, ultimately Poland in World War II. I mean, all I'm suggesting is that a continual accommodation of American foreign policy to Soviet interests, whether they're in Africa, the Middle East, or anywhere else in the world, seems to me is going to bring on a condition in which this will not be a peaceful world, nor will it be a free world for ourselves and our allies.
You want to come back to that?
Yes. Let me just expand a little, because I think we're on to an interesting question that the gentleman just raised. I think that if you look at what's happened in the last 10 years in the standing of the United States and the standing of the Soviet Union, I think you'd have to say that the last 10 years have not been great years for the superpowers. Both superpowers have suffered some setbacks. The United States, obviously, and most particularly in the case of Southeast Asia. But I think that on balance, the last 10 years have been worse for the Soviet Union than for the United States. We tend to exaggerate or emphasize, whenever we talk about what's going on, we tend to emphasize what's happened in Angola and that the Soviets are making inroads into southern Africa, or maybe the Italian elections, and that various countries are having communists in their government, and look on these things as being favorable to the Soviet Union. If you look at what's happened to the Soviet Union over the last 10, 12 years, it's been pretty tough times. In the first place, they've lost their best ally, which is China. In 1964, we all assumed that any war with Russia meant a war with China too. We can't make that assumption. In fact, the most likely war right now is a war between China and Russia. Secondly, the Soviet Union have had just a miserable policy in the Middle East. I can't believe how lousy they've handled the Middle East situation. They end up everybody's enemy. It's incredible how they could have loused that up. Thirdly, they are now dependent upon, of all things, the United States for their supply of wheat. Now, let's just take those three things. Suppose they had happened to the United States. Suppose the United States had lost its greatest ally. In other words, its greatest ally, Western Europe, had suddenly in the last 10 years become an enemy. And suppose we had been expelled from the Middle East and just ended up botching it terribly. And suppose we were dependent upon the Soviet Union for wheat. Can you imagine the uproar that would be going on in this country about this, what's happening to the trends and how the Soviets are getting stronger and how we're getting weaker? I mean, the administration in Washington would be run out of town on a rail. Now, that doesn't happen in Moscow because they haven't got any elections. But it's been a disaster. I mean, the administration, the Soviets, the last 10 years have been, and that leaves aside a lot of other cases. Romania is moving towards more independence. They almost had a chance to do something in Portugal and botched it up. Southeast Asia has thrown the United States out, but that doesn't mean they have moved into Soviet orbit, and even half-crazed Cambodia hasn't cozied up to the Soviet Union. The last 10 years in the Soviet Union have not been very good. And they've had a couple of cases where they've had some successes. I think Angola, Southern Africa, has been a success. But they've blundered in a lot of places. I think that on balance, they've come out of this last 10 years a lot worse than we have.
You want to come back, Ken?
Absolutely. Well, I would agree with Les. The Soviets are not 10 feet tall. They've made mistakes, continue to make mistakes, made blunders, and there have been steps backward. And Lenin talked about taking steps backward a number of generations ago in order to take 2 or 3 forwards. But to suggest that the Soviets are worse off today vis-a-vis the United States than the last 10 years for the Soviet Union has been a disaster is just patently absurd and totally inconsistent with the recent experience in history, in the real world. Again, I sound like a broken record, John, but the Soviet buildup in strategic nuclear capability and their conventional arms is incredible. Whether you want to say right now or 2 years henceforth or 5 years henceforth, by the 1980s, just on land-based intercontinental ballistic warheads, they will be moving, as they MERV their new generation of launchers, from 1,600 warheads to 8,400 warheads. MERVed SS-18s, 19s, and 17s. They are developing a mobile ICBM. This nation is so far away from any mobile-launched intercontinental ballistic missile, it's incredible. We're 10 years away from any advanced missile, the MX, and we're light years away, perhaps, from the type of a warhead. I shouldn't say that. We are not light years away, but we're a number of years away from the type of an advanced warhead for our Minutemen III that most of us think ought to be developed.
Next question, please.
My name is Greg Rushford. I was a staff member with the former House Intelligence Committee. I have a question to either of the panelists. There has been much confusion lately over the subject of whether the Soviets are complying with the provisions of the SALT agreements or not. Former Defense Secretary Laird and other high officials have alleged that the Russians are not negotiating in good faith and have not lived up to the terms and the spirit, at least, of the 1972 SALT Accords. Can either of the panelists offer anything to clarify the situation?
You want to start off?
I think that basically the Soviet Union has not, emphasized not, in any substantive way violated the SALT Accords. They are, to be sure, going to take advantage of any ambiguities that exist in the Accords. There are, to be sure, a lot of ambiguities for them to take advantage of. There are, to be sure, a lot of things, misperceptions about what the Accords mean and what they don't mean among Congress and the general public, thanks to the overselling of the Accords by the administration. But when you come right down to it, have the Soviets substantially violated the SALT agreements? The answer, I think, is no. If we were to take it into a court of law, if we were to take it into a tribunal of honest opinion, I would say that the answer is no. Now, to be sure, in that marvelous phrase of Scoop Jackson's, they're going down the hotel corridor trying every door. But they do not, they have not substantially violated the Accords, and the inadvertent or perhaps inadvertent or the unsubstantiated violations, insubstantial violations which have occurred are matched by similar, what I would consider insubstantial violations on our part.
Mr. Congressman, do you want to?
Oh, I find that statement incredible, that Soviet violations of SALT are matched by, as minuscule as they might be, are matched by those of the United States. One need only look at the condition of the SALT talks today vis-a-vis where it was in 1969 and 68 when the SALT talks began in terms of our strategic nuclear position, to understand that they have pushed those ambiguities and nuances and loopholes to the absolute ultimate limit. I would agree with my friend that SALT was oversold, and that was a mistake. I would agree that some of the violations, the ones to which the Soviets have even admitted just a few weeks ago of not dismantling their SS-7s and SS-8s while they deploy their Delta-class nuclear subs, I would agree that that is not as substantial as perhaps some would argue. But it is substantial to the extent that we are willing to accept this so casually, so cavalierly. Willingness to accept replacing the SS-11 light intercontinental ballistic missile that the Soviets had just a few years ago with what was our interpretation of a heavy missile, and now our Secretary of State tells us that the SS-19 is indeed not a heavy missile, even though it's 50% bigger than the SS-11 that it replaces. We now accept that in total opposition to our understanding just a few years ago. We accept that as a light missile. The construction of silos that are concealed, that have blast-away covers that they call command and control centers, has allowed them to expand their silos by 100 to 150. There are several areas that ought to point up to the United States that indeed we are not working hard enough in that verification process, that we ought to be much more careful as we enter into this another current round of negotiations over the codification, if that's possible, of the Vladivostok Understanding, to make us recognize what a serious situation it is for us to negotiate with anything less than total reciprocity and on a total quid pro quo process. And I would suggest that that has not taken place based upon the evidence that I see in the last few years of the SALT negotiations.
Sir?
Yeah, I think that some of the examples that Congressman Kemp gave are examples of confusion on our part. That light and heavy missile, the Russians never agreed to our definition of a light and heavy missile. We had a unilateral statement as to what a light and heavy missile was, and Congress was led to believe by testimony from the administration that the Russians were accepting this definition of light and heavy missile, but in fact they never did. And there's no evidence that they ever accepted it, so when they didn't accede to it, they haven't broken the accords because they never agreed to it. And other things where they have done things and we have protested and they have stopped. And I think those kind of things are going to go on. This is a big world, and it's a big bureaucracy, and things go on in parts of a country that other parts don't know they're going on. The case where we violated the accords was on covers on the Minuteman silos. The agreement specifically said it no covers so that you could see what was going on. They were working on Minuteman silos out in North Dakota. It got cold, and they put covers up because they wanted some heat. And naturally enough, these are guys just working on a silo. Happened to be a violation of the SALT Accords. And eventually it was called detention, and we took the covers off. Those kind of things are going to happen. I don't say that in the Russians' case all of those things are that innocent. But the fact is that that they have backed off on a few things when we have protested. And as I say, I don't think that in any impartial court of law that we could, that a case could be made that the Russians have violated the accords.
We have time for one more question. Sir?
Ed Hollyberg, Fleet Reserve Association. We've been addressing hardware all morning. May I address personnel?
Please do.
What impact do you think the unionization of military would have on a defense posture and budget?
On the unionization of military personnel would have on defense posture and budget. I think like all unionization, it would mean that the wages would go up and you couldn't eliminate jobs to save your life. So I would think that what it means is that the force structure stays the same or gets bigger and the wages go up. And I think that's the goal of all unions, is to protect jobs and to protect standards of living. I think unionization of the military forces would be an absolute disaster.
I strongly agree with Les, and I very much opposed to the unionization of the military. It would take, as he pointed out earlier, we're spending a tremendous amount of our defense budget on personnel and on wages and fringe benefits and pensions and just the human cost of our forces, and it seems to me that it would push it into astronomical terms. Plus, it would, I think, diminish the ability of this nation to spend what is necessary in the areas that I mentioned earlier, conventional and strategic capabilities. So I join him in total and complete opposition to such an attempt.
All right, this concludes another rational debate in the Public Policy Forum series presented by the American Enterprise Institute for Public Policy Research. On behalf of AEI, our heartfelt thanks to the distinguished debaters, Representative Kemp and Aspin, and also to our guests in the audience for their participation in the question segment.
This Public Policy Forum on the subject, How Much Defense Spending is Enough, has brought you the opinions of two experts in the field. It was presented by AEI, the American Enterprise Institute. It is the aim of AEI to clarify issues of the day by presenting many viewpoints, in the hope that by so doing, those interested in the decision-making process will benefit from such a free exchange of informed and enlightened opinion. I'm Peter Hackus in Washington.
This Public Policy Forum series is created and supplied to this station as a public service by the American Enterprise Institute, Washington, D.C. For a transcript of this program, send $3.75 to the American Enterprise Institute, 1150 17th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C., 20036.